There is tension in the room. Do you feel it? Cut with a knife, tension. It's the sort of tension that the can we not just all get along people like me want to avoid at all costs. Let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about it. It just makes matters worse. Let's just paper over it and maybe it will go away. It will be forgotten. There is tension in the room. And if you grew up as the class clown or the family clown, you want to admit to that? You feel the tension and you want to do something, tell a joke or make a face or pull a prank, do something to get everybody's mind off of the tension. A lot of acting out ADHD diagnosed children are on medication and they're really only doing what comes natural when you're reacting to tension. There's tension in the room. And if you grew up as the scapegoat, the black sheep of the family, anybody relate to that?
Yeah.
Well, it's hard not to go into that place of creating a crisis, a self-inflicted episode of self-destruction that will get everybody's focus off of the tension. There's tension in the room. Quick, somebody give me a refill or a snort or a toke or pass the pills. For it may be destroying my life, but it's getting me away from the tension. There's tension in the room. Do you not feel it? Jesus is in the room and there is tension. Jesus, who calms the storm for the disciples in the boat, is in today's scripture stirring up a storm at the place of worship. Can we sit with Jesus amid the tension this morning? The tension comes as Jesus is leading the service at the synagogue, and a woman shows up who has been crippled with arthritis for 18 years, bent over sort of crippled. Now, some of you know what that is like. You know what it is like for your joints to ache and swell and to have so much pain that getting out of bed in the morning is a pain in the, well, put whatever part of the anatomy in the blank you want to. In more recent times, medical professionals have come to offer many new treatments for diseases of the joints, and people are getting new knees, and they're getting new hips and new shoulders, and we are coming to understand more and more the intimate connection between our bodies and our minds and our spirits. And so there is now even medication for depression that hurts. Have you seen that advertised? When you hurt all of the time, it must be easy to become depressed. And when you're depressed, it must be easier to focus on all that hurts. The woman who presents herself at the synagogue service this day is caught in that very trap. Her infirmity and her struggles are evident for everyone to see. Jesus sees her. The leader of the synagogue also sees her. But he does not want to see her. And so, in a sense, he does not see her. Now, before we get up on our high horse and we start condemning the synagogue leader as a religious bigot with whom we have nothing in common, let's be honest. Sometimes we see people in their needs and we don't want to see them. Or sometimes we see animals and their needs and we don't want to see them. I cannot take another abused or wounded puppy home with me, okay? So I will say to Jean as we're driving down the road, just don't look, don't look that way, just turn your head, don't look. We see, but we don't want to see. And as a result, being the evolving and adaptive creatures we are, we have developed very sophisticated and justifiable and defensible blinders that we put on, don't we? Ways to not see what we really see. And to tell ourselves we're still being good people, we're still good Christians, even though we're seeing what we don't want to see. There is tension in the room here today because you see, Jesus sees the woman in her needs. He sees her in her present state and condition as a child of God. But the leader of the synagogue, and perhaps others in the room that day, see the woman in her needs, but they don't see her as a child of God. To them, she is a nuisance. She's a problem. She's a case number. Jesus sees her, and he stops right there in the middle of the service. He goes completely off script. He travels away from the order of service in the bulletin to let the woman know, I see you. I see you in your need. Now, there's nothing in the story that indicates the woman asked to be seen. Nothing here says that she came in demanding that the world stop and attend to her immediately. Jesus is the one who takes the initiative to acknowledge her presence and to give attention to her condition. My friend and colleague in ministry, Reverend Deb Richardson Moore, pastor of our sister church, Triune Mercy Center in Greenville, says one day, one of the homeless persons that had come to the church said something to her that has stuck with her ever since. She said, you know, of all the things that are most difficult for me to deal with as a homeless person is this: I feel invisible. Not seen. Have you ever felt invisible? Maybe sometimes when we do something for which we would like not to be caught, we would like to be invisible, right? Or sometimes when we've said something for which we are ashamed, we would like to be invisible. But most of us have not gone through our lives invisible to the world. But the homeless report feeling invisible to the world. But even more tragic than being invisible to the world, they report feeling invisible to the church of Jesus Christ. Oh my. Deb Richardson Moore and others at Triune Mercy Center set out to fashion a church where the homeless and the poor and the addicted were not invisible, but they were seen. They were not only seen, they were offered a home, a spiritual home, a place to belong, a place to be welcomed, even when life around them was not very neat and tidy. And God led some of us 3 years ago to see that this empty church building here on South Main Street could become such a church. How are we doing? Jesus sees a woman who wasn't even supposed to be there that day. First of all, she was a woman. That was her first problem. And women were not to be noticed at the synagogue. You see, the synagogue, the place of teaching about God, was for the men. The women could come, but like children, they were not to be seen or heard. They were to keep their heads covered and their mouths shut. If they had a question, they were to save it for later. They could ask their husbands when they got home. Remember, Paul told them that, didn't he? So have you got it, women? Well, where's your headscarf or hat today? What kind of Bible believers are you? I've even heard some of you talking here this morning. You see, there's tension in the room, and Jesus has created the tension by opening his eyes and his heart and discarding tradition, discarding custom and common practice to offer this woman healing for her affliction, and to do it right then and there in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Well, his action is a clear violation of the letter of the law. It's a violation of the Bible, of his people. And the synagogue leader has to say something about it. Notice, though, that the synagogue leader doesn't say it directly to Jesus, does he? What a coward he is. You see, it's easier to get tough with one who we see as weak. So the synagogue leader, the meeting place president, the Message calls him, says to the woman, 6 days have been defined as work days, so you can come on one of the 6 days if you want to be healed, but don't come here on the 7th. It's our Sabbath. We have our rules. We have our policies and our procedures. It's right there in the book. You can read it for yourself, or I will be happy to point it out to you. It's not that we don't want to help. It's just that your timing and your situation do not fit into our mold. We're closed today. We all have to have a day off. We'll give you an appointment card. You can come back 3 weeks from Monday at 2:30. Now, don't be late, though, because you see we have lots of people to see, and if you don't get here on time, well, we'll just move on. And when you come, you must bring 2 forms of identification. And one will need to be a state-issued picture ID. Now, we'll run a background check on you and a drug screen. Now, if you don't have your ID, you will need a copy of your birth certificate or your social security card. Now, if you were born out of state, it will be ordered for you, and you'll need to provide a money order for $65. Now, if you were born in the state of New York, well, you'll need to know the county or the borough in which you were born, because your birth certificate has to be ordered directly from the Bible Records Office in that particular location. Have you got it? And Jesus hears all of that, and he goes off on them. Jesus calls the synagogue leader a fraud. A religious fraud. Oh my goodness, there is so much tension in the room. Things have come to a head. It is 2 opposing ideologies. It is 2 completely different ways of dealing with people. It is 2 conflicting and competing priorities. It has all come to a head. It is a confrontation over the question of what matters the most. What matters the most? Jesus says, this woman, she matters the most. And the synagogue leader says, our way of doing things, our doctrines, our literal Bible interpretations, our belief about the authority of Scripture, that's what matters the most, not this woman. Well, who's right? Jesus or the synagogue leader? What matters the most? That's one of those life-defining questions. What matters the most to you? Preacher and writer and sociologist Tony Campolo tells about a study that was done among persons 95 years of age and older. 50 people aged 95 or older were asked what they would do differently if they had their life to live over again. And they responded with basically 3 answers. 1, they would risk more. They would live less cautiously and risk more. 2, they would reflect more. on their life, not just go through life day by day, but stop and reflect upon things. And 3, they would do more things that would live on after they were dead. They talked about how they would have spent more time with people who were important to them in their lives and less time trying to finish all the tasks of the day. Many of them said they would have wasted less time worrying about things they could not change anyway, and more time working on things they could change. And most of them said they wished they would have lived more while they were living. Another way to frame that thought, living more while living, is to ask ourselves this question. 10 years from now, what will you remember about today? August 21st, 2016. On August 21st, 2026, what will you remember about today? Will you remember the order of service here? Got it memorized? Will you remember the scripture passage just read? Will you remember what hymns we sang? Will you remember if everything went according to the plan of the service today? No, none of us will likely remember any of that. I can't remember what we did 2 weeks ago. I have to go back. I saved these so I can remember what's on there. But if today, here in this place, you meet somebody, maybe for the first time, and that person says a kind word to you that you really needed to hear today, you might remember that. You might remember that person. Or if you came in here today feeling lonely, or afraid, or sad, or confused, or hurtful, and somebody here just put out a hand to you and squeezed your hand, or opened their arms to you and hugged your neck, I bet you will remember how that felt. Jesus knows that this woman who has made her way to the synagogue that day with her arthritis flaring, a day when even getting out of bed must have been a battle for her, he knows what kind of effort she has made to be there that day. Jesus knows that she might not remember much of his sermon that day, and she might not remember how well all the people of the synagogue kept all of the rules that day, or she most certainly is not going to remember that indeed they kept the Sabbath rule and did everything like they were supposed to do, but she is going to remember that Jesus noticed her that day in the crowd. She is going to remember Jesus stopping in the middle of the busyness of his day and reaching out his hand to her. She is going to remember that Jesus treated her as a precious child of God. And she is going to remember that Jesus spoke to her words that were healing and hopeful. She will never forget this day, will she? Never. She will never forget Jesus. Would you like a day like that? The good news is Jesus will never forget her either. Nor will he ever forget you or me. That's just who Jesus is. Now,